Deep within the echoes of time, the forgotten files awake.
A tale of gods, heroes, betrayal, and fate. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Whether you're winding down after a long day, or drifting off under a blanket of stars, I invite you to get cozy, breathe deep, and let your mind wander to ancient shores and marble halls. This is a story thousands of years old, and tonight, it's all yours. Long before the first sword was drawn at the gates of Troy, before the sails of 1,000 ships darkened the Aegean Sea, there was a wedding. And as with many great tragedies, it began not with fury or ambition, but with celebration. In the age when gods still walked among mortals and fate spun its intricate web beneath every banquet and blessing, the immortals of Olympus gathered for a rare union, one that would unknowingly set the world on fire. The bride was Thetis, a sea nymph of ethereal grace and power, daughter of the ancient sea god Nereus. She was not merely beautiful, though even that word fails her. She was elemental, sculpted from salt and foam, known for her shape-shifting nature and elusive heart. So captivating was she that Zeus himself once pursued her, and Poseidon too, but a prophecy turned their lust to fear. It was said that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father, a child destined to surpass any who sired him. No god dared tempt that fate, and so, to avoid the risk of being overthrown by their own progeny, the gods decreed she would marry a mortal. That mortal was Peleus, a hero in his own right, a prince of Phthia and descendant of Aeacus. Brave, dutiful, and favored by the gods, Peleus was not chosen by Thetis, he was chosen for her. The union was arranged, as so many were in those days, not for love, but to preserve the balance of power. Thetis resisted at first, slipping into fire, water, wind, and beast to escape him. But Peleus held fast, aided by the wisdom of the centaur Chiron. In time, she yielded. And so it was that a sea goddess was bound to a mortal man. Their wedding was held on Mount Pelion, high in Thessaly, where the pine trees whispered ancient songs and the stars burned cold and curious above. It was no humble affair. The gods came down from Olympus in full regalia, robed in fire and lightning, adorned in golden laurels, their laughter echoing across mountains. Apollo played his lyre, and the muses sang of fate and time. Ambrosia flowed like river water, and mortals dared not approach. This was a celebration of rare magnitude, meant to bless the world with a heroic legacy, and perhaps in some way it did. But amid the wine and music and divine laughter, a shadow slipped through the feast, a shadow not of mortal doom, but of divine spite. For one goddess had not been invited. Her name was Eris, the goddess of strife, discord, and everything that grows from wounded pride. She was not loved, not even feared, only avoided. Wherever she walked, friendships curdled, alliances crumbled, and blood stained the earth. Knowing this, Zeus had barred her from the wedding. But gods, even unwelcome, do not always stay away. And so, Eris arrived unannounced, her footsteps soundless, her presence a chill. She did not shout or rage. Instead, she offered a gift, a golden apple, perfectly shaped, its surface inscribed with 3 fateful words, "To the fairest." Then, without a word, she vanished. At first, the guests murmured, "An apple? A jest? A curse?" But soon, The weight of those words began to burn in the minds of the goddesses present. 3 stepped forward. Hera, queen of Olympus, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire. Each believed the apple was meant for her. Each was certain she was the fairest among all. What began as a wedding gift would become the spark that ignited a world-spanning war. But on that day, under the silver clouds and golden songs, no one yet saw the full shape of what had begun. The wine still flowed, and the bride still smiled, though the fates had already started to weave a darker thread into her veil. The war had not started yet, but the gods had been insulted, pride had been wounded, and mortals had been placed on a path from which there would be no return. The apple rolled, gleaming in the grass. The world would never be the same. The golden apple did not remain a simple trinket cast among the grass. In the hands of goddesses, even fruit can become a weapon, and this one was no exception. Inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," the apple of Eris became the fulcrum on which vanity, ambition, and divine rivalry would pivot. The feast on Mount Pelion had ended, but the discord it sowed had only begun to bloom. Hera, queen of the gods and wife to Zeus, saw it as her due. She was the ruler of Olympus alongside her husband, regal and stern, the matron of marriage and family. Athena, daughter of Zeus, born fully formed from her father's head, claimed it by merit. She was the goddess of wisdom, of justice, of heroic warfare, and no one could deny her clarity of mind or martial grace. Aphrodite, the youngest of the 3, goddess of beauty and desire, smiled softly as she took her place beside them. Her power was more subtle, more dangerous. Where Hera commanded and Athena calculated, Aphrodite simply was, alluring without effort, adored without argument. Zeus, to whom the dispute was brought, saw the storm brewing behind the beauty. He was no fool. To choose among them was to court disaster, and he had no interest in provoking the wrath of either wife or daughter. With a cunning smile and a shrug that bore the weight of many wars avoided, he passed the burden on to another. "Let a mortal decide," he declared. "Let a man untouched by Olympus weigh the goddesses and judge." That man was Paris, a Trojan prince by birth, but a shepherd by life. His story was already marked by divine interference. At his birth, a prophecy foretold that he would bring about the destruction of Troy. To avoid such a fate, King Priam and Queen Hecuba ordered the child exposed on Mount Ida, left to die of cold and time. But fate is not so easily undone. A herdsman found the infant and raised him in obscurity, and so Paris grew not in a palace but among flocks, his beauty rivaling that of the gods, his charm already legendary. To Mount Ida came Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger, bearing the 3 goddesses and the gleaming apple. Paris, unaware of what he was being asked to judge, stood on a quiet hillside, the air still with the weight of something enormous. The goddesses appeared before him in their glory, each one a vision of power, grace, and divine splendor. They did not simply stand before him. They made their cases, and in doing so, they betrayed the depths of their ambition. Hera offered power. If Paris chose her, she would make him lord over all of Asia. His name would be spoken with fear and reverence. Kingdoms would bow, and empires would kneel. Athena offered wisdom and victory. She promised him a warrior's glory, eternal renown, and mastery in battle. No army could stand against him. No enemy would outthink him. But Aphrodite said nothing of war or rule. She offered something more ancient than either. She offered love. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, wife to King Menelaus, famed for her beauty across all of Greece. Aphrodite promised that Helen would be his, and that her heart would burn only for him. Paris, who had known neither throne nor glory, who had grown among the simple rhythms of a shepherd's life, did not hesitate long. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. In doing so, he earned her favor, and with it, sealed his fate. He also earned the eternal enmity of Hera and Athena, goddesses who would never forgive the slight, nor forget the consequences. That simple act, made under the soft sun of Ida, would echo across oceans and through generations. Paris had judged beauty above power, desire above wisdom, and love above war. But war would come all the same, and somewhere on Olympus, Eris would have smiled. In the city of Sparta, at the edge of the Peloponnesian hills, stood the palace of Menelaus, king of the Lacedaemonians. His throne was not as grand as Agamemnon's at Mycenae, nor his armies the largest in Greece, but his household was graced by a woman whose name had already become legend. Helen was more than beautiful. She was myth made flesh, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, said to have been born from an egg after the king of the gods took the form of a swan to seduce or ravish her mother, depending on the tale one prefers. Her face, it would later be said, could launch 1,000 ships, but in those days it simply turned heads and stirred kingdoms to jealousy. Helen had been courted by many, too many for peace to endure if one was chosen over the others. Princes and warlords came from every corner of Greece, each hoping to claim her as bride and ally. To prevent bloodshed and preserve his own position, Helen's mortal father Tyndareus, under the counsel of the clever Odysseus of Ithaca, had all suitors swear a binding oath. Whosoever won Helen's hand, the others would defend that union, and should anyone dare to take her from her husband, all swore to wage war in her husband's name. That oath, made lightly by men still hoping to win her, would one day bind them all to ruin. Menelaus won her hand. He made her queen of Sparta, and by most accounts she was not unhappy. They had a daughter, Hermione. Their lives, if not extraordinary, were stable and admired. But then Paris arrived. The Trojan prince came not as a raider or conqueror, but as a guest, welcomed into Menelaus's home under the sacred laws of hospitality. The Greeks called it xenia, a bond between host and guest so holy that even the gods upheld it. To break such trust was no mere insult. It was a crime against the divine. Yet even under Menelaus's roof, with Sparta's warriors nearby and the bonds of peace in place, Paris cast his eyes upon Helen, and she did not look away. There are many versions of what happened next. Some say Aphrodite clouded Helen's mind, bending her heart to Paris through enchantment. Others claim Helen went willingly, moved by desire, by fate, or by something no one could name. A few later poets would call her a traitor, others a victim of the gods, but none can deny what occurred. When Menelaus departed for Crete to attend a funeral, Paris acted. He spoke soft words, perhaps promises, perhaps illusions. When he left Sparta, Helen left with him. Some say she took treasures from the palace, gold and silk and ivory ornaments, as if she were not fleeing, but migrating. The ships waited, sleek and silent on the horizon, and by the time Menelaus returned, they were gone. To Troy they sailed, across the wine-dark sea, past islands and storms, with Aphrodite's favor like wind in their sails. Behind them, they left not just an empty bed and an outraged king, but a violated oath, a broken alliance, and a question that would tear the Greek world apart. Was Helen stolen, or did she choose? Was she captive, or conspirator? Even then, the answer was unclear, but to Menelaus and to the Greeks who had sworn their loyalty, it mattered little. What mattered was that she was gone, taken, and there could be no peace until she was returned. In Troy, King Priam welcomed Paris with open arms. The city was ancient, mighty, rich in towers and history. Its walls had been built by gods. Behind those walls now stood Helen of Sparta, her presence both a prize and a curse. Some among the Trojans rejoiced, dazzled by her beauty. Others muttered darkly, sensing doom in her arrival. But it was too late. Across the Aegean, kings began to stir. Swords were drawn from beneath beds, where they had long slept in peace. Ships were hauled to shore and readied for war. Old oaths were remembered, and old rivalries reignited. Helen was in Troy, and Greece would come for her. Not for love, perhaps, and not only for honor, but because a promise had been broken, and because pride is louder than reason. The gods watched in silence. The winds began to change. The war had not yet begun, but it had already become inevitable. Before she was ever a queen, before her name passed through the mouths of poets and soldiers like a torch through dry grass, Helen was already a figure of desire and consequence. From the moment she came of age, her beauty was no longer just admired. It was weaponized, spoken of in hushed awe or loud challenge across every kingdom of Greece. Kings, princes, warlords, and heroes journeyed to Sparta, not for conquest or treaty, but for the chance to court the daughter of Zeus. She was not merely the fairest of mortal women. She was the daughter of a god and the jewel of the Spartan line. To win her hand would be to gain not only a powerful alliance, but a measure of divine favor. To lose her, it was feared, could mean civil war. Tyndareus, the mortal king of Sparta and Helen's legal father, stood at the center of a storm he had no power to stop. Dozens of suitors arrived, bearing gifts, boasting of their deeds, each more eager than the last. Among them were names that would one day shape the world. Menelaus of Mycenaean blood, brother to mighty Agamemnon. Odysseus of Ithaca, clever and sharp-tongued, more reliant on wit than muscle. Ajax of Salamis, vast as a mountain and slow to smile. Diomedes, bold and pragmatic. Even Palamedes, fated to outshine Odysseus for a time in wisdom and invention. Each man sought her favor, and none were willing to concede the prize to another. Tyndareus, for all his power, found himself paralyzed. If he chose one suitor, he would offend all the others. If he delayed, the tension would break into violence. He stood not as a king, but as a man guarding a tinderbox. And so he did what the wise often do when they face a problem greater than themselves. He listened. It was Odysseus who spoke the answer. The king of Ithaca knew his chances of winning Helen were slim, and so he bargained. He asked for the hand of Penelope, Tyndareus' niece, and in exchange he would offer a solution that would spare Sparta from bloodshed. Tyndareus agreed, and Odysseus proposed an oath. Odysseus, every suitor, he said, should swear a solemn vow. They would defend the chosen husband of Helen. They would stand with him should anyone ever attempt to steal her away or threaten the bond of marriage. In return for this oath, they would accept the final choice and leave Sparta in peace. One by one, the suitors agreed. Perhaps they believed the oath would never be tested. Perhaps they believed Helen would choose wisely, or that fate would never tempt such a breach. But they swore it all the same, their hands raised, their words carried on the still Spartan air. Helen chose Menelaus. He was not the most powerful nor the most brilliant, but he was of good lineage, and his claim was respectable. The others accepted it, some bitterly, some with feigned grace. They returned to their homes and their wars, their wives and councils, the oath already receding in memory. But oaths are living things. They wait. They sleep like seeds beneath the soil, undisturbed until storm or fire brings them to bloom. When Paris took Helen from Sparta, when the ships left under night's veil, and the sun rose on an empty bed, that ancient oath awakened, and with it, the long road to war began to rise from the dust. When Menelaus returned from Crete and crossed the threshold of his palace, he found silence waiting for him. Not the soft hush of evening, but the cold emptiness of absence. The hearth was cold, the chambers deserted, and the queen's guards stood in confusion and shame. Servants whispered of ships seen on the horizon and of foreign hands gathering treasures in haste. There was no battle, no struggle, no bloodshed. But Helen was gone, and so too was Paris of Troy, the guest to whom he had offered his roof, his table, and his peace. Menelaus stood stunned. Not only had he lost his wife, he had lost her to a man who had shared his salt, drunk his wine, and slept beneath his protection. It was not merely an insult, it was a violation of the sacred code that bound mortals and gods alike. The law of hospitality, revered across all of Greece, had been torn apart in his own home. For a man of pride, the injury was unbearable. For a king, it was a summons to action. He did not delay. From Sparta, he rode to Mycenae, where his brother Agamemnon ruled in wealth and iron, a king of greater reach and darker ambition. Though their blood was the same, the two men were different as storm and stillness. Agamemnon was a warlord by nature, always seeking to extend his grasp, to unify the squabbling Greek kingdoms under a single banner, his own. The abduction of Helen offered not only a cause for vengeance, but a pretext for conquest. And so, when Menelaus stood before his brother and spoke of Paris, of Troy, and of the oath sworn by Helen's former suitors, Agamemnon listened with growing interest. Together they summoned the kings of Greece. Messengers were sent to every coast and island. Riders thundered through olive groves and mountain passes. From Pylos to Argos, from Ithaca to Thebes, the call went out. The suitors who had once pledged their swords in peace were now called to honor their word in war. The oath that had slept in comfort now demanded sacrifice. Some responded at once, eager for glory or duty or the thrill of battle. Others hesitated, bound by their own troubles or wary of distant vengeance. Not all were willing. Not all believed Helen worth the blood of thousands. And yet, the oath held power. It was spoken in sacred trust, and to break it would stain not only a man's honor, but his legacy. Reputation in the Greek world was no small thing. It was the shield against time, the echo a man left behind when his bones turned to dust. And so they came. Ships were readied. Armor was reforged. Young men were summoned from fields and halls, told they would sail to a city they had never seen, for a queen they had never met. And behind it all stood Menelaus, cold with fury, and Agamemnon, already imagining not just the rescue of a brother's wife, but the crowning of himself as the high king of all Greece. But the road to Troy would not be swift. Heroes still lingered in hiding. Prophecies had yet to unfold. The gods, though watching, had not yet taken sides. The winds remained still. The storm was gathering, but its full force was still to come. The task of assembling the Greek coalition was not a simple matter of summoning warriors and launching ships. Greece in that age was a land of many kingdoms, each proud, each ruled by its own laws and lineages. There was no central throne to command them. only an ancient network of alliances and rivalries, blood ties and broken pacts. To call upon the kings and warlords of such a fractured land required not only force and reason, but cunning, patience, and persuasion. Menelaus had the cause, but it was Agamemnon who had the will and reach to forge these many blades into a single sword. One by one, the lords of Greece were summoned to fulfill the oath they had once made in Sparta. Many remembered it well, though some had made it only out of vanity or political gain. Nestor of Pylos, already aged but wise beyond measure, answered without hesitation. He had fought in wars before and saw in this one the last great chapter of his life. Ajax the Greater came from Salamis, a mountain of a man whose strength on the battlefield was matched only by his honor. Diomedes of Argos answered as well, young but already famed for his valor. Menestheus came from Athens, Idomeneus from Crete, and many others from lands whose names are now known more from poetry than memory. But two names stood apart from the rest. Two men whose fates would shape the war more than any other. One was the clever king of Ithaca. The other was the greatest warrior the world had ever known. Odysseus had no desire to fight in the war. Though he had helped devise the oath of Tyndareus, he had done so only to secure Penelope's hand in marriage. Now that he had her, along with a newborn son, Telemachus, he saw no honor in leaving his family to pursue another man's quarrel. When the messengers came to Ithaca, Odysseus feigned madness. He yoked a donkey and an ox together and began ploughing his fields with salt, muttering nonsense and avoiding all mention of Troy. But cleverness, even when it plays at madness, cannot long deceive those who know how to look. Palamedes, a rival in wit and ambition, placed the infant Telemachus in the path of the plough. Odysseus turned aside. His mind was sound. He had been exposed, and the war claimed him. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, was harder to find. His mother, knowing the fate that awaited him, had hidden him on the island of Scyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. She had no wish to see her son march to Troy, for she knew, as all the gods did, that should Achilles go to war, he would never return. His name would be eternal, but his life would be brief. Glory or obscurity, immortality of name, or the comfort of years. There could be no middle path. Odysseus was sent to find him. Arriving at Scyros with gifts and wares, he laid them before the women of the court. Among the bracelets and gowns, he placed a shield, a sword, and a spear. While the others admired the silks and jewels, one girl reached for the weapons. It was Achilles. The disguise fell, and the hero rose. He would go to Troy, knowing what it would cost. The coalition took shape. Shipwrights labored along the shores, and fleets began to form in harbors from every corner of the Greek world. Supplies were gathered, prayers were offered, omens read. The harbor at Aulis filled with warriors, thousands upon thousands, their sails white as the wings of seabirds, their bronze armor gleaming beneath the sun. They came for Helen, but they also came for vengeance, for glory, and for their names to be remembered long after their bones had turned to dust. The greatest war of the age was about to begin. The kings had gathered. The warriors stood ready. But the gods, as always, had other plans. Before a single oar touched the sea, before the wind stirred the great sails bound for Troy, the gods watched in silence, and the fates wove threads that mortals had yet to see. The Greek kings had made their vows, and the men had sharpened their blades, but not all of the champions of the coming war had yet been drawn to the cause. The greatest minds, and the greatest warrior, still lingered outside the tide of destiny. as if fate itself were holding its breath before setting the storm in motion. Odysseus of Ithaca was known already across the Isles as a man who wielded words as deftly as others wielded swords. His mind was sharp as flint, and his tongue could turn the hearts of men more quickly than steel could part their flesh. Yet even he, for all his cunning, had tried to avoid the war. He had made the oath of Tyndareus as a bargain, not a conviction, and when the call came, he had no desire to leave his quiet island, his young wife Penelope, or his infant son Telemachus. His palace was modest, but it was his own. He had no need for Helen, nor any hunger for the blood and smoke that would come of her. When the messengers arrived, Odysseus greeted them not as a soldier, but as a madman. He yoked a donkey and an ox to a plough, sowed salt into his fields, and muttered nonsense as if his mind had cracked. But clever men often meet their match in other clever men. Palamedes, sent by Agamemnon to recruit him, saw through the act. He placed Telemachus, the infant son of Odysseus, directly in front of the plough's path. Odysseus halted at once. His madness was undone, his mask discarded, and though he did not weep, those close enough to see him said there was a sorrow in his eyes that no poem has ever fully captured. He left his home. He kissed his wife and cradled his son, and he boarded the ship that would take him away from Ithaca. Though he would one day return, that journey would become legend, a second Odyssey to match the first. But that story was still far in the future. For now, Odysseus had committed himself to a war not of his choosing, and he would not return the same man who had left. Achilles was another matter entirely. If Odysseus was the mind of the Greeks, Achilles was their fire. Born of a mortal king and a sea goddess, raised in the cave of the centaur Chiron, he was swift and radiant and deadly. Even as a boy, he had the bearing of a hero from an older age. Yet his mother Thetis, wise and prophetic, knew too well what the war would demand. It had been foretold that Achilles would either live a long life of obscurity or die young with his name remembered forever. And Thetis, like any mother, wanted her son to live. To hide him from the war, she sent him to the island of Scyros, where he was disguised as a girl and hidden among the daughters of King Lycomedes. There he lived in shadow, away from the world's eyes, even as the fires of Troy began to smolder in the distance. But fate and Odysseus came for him all the same. Arriving on Scyros in the guise of a merchant, Odysseus laid out an array of goods before the daughters of the king. Among the jewelry and garments, he placed a sword and a spear. As the women admired the silks and golden combs, one of them reached not for the bracelets, but for the blade. That hand was not a maiden's. It belonged to Achilles. With his disguise cast aside, Achilles did not hesitate. The call to war stirred something fierce in him. He had been raised for this moment. He would go to Troy, though he knew the cost. He would win glory that would never fade, though his life would burn swiftly and be gone. Thetis wept, but she could not stop him. No goddess, however powerful, can unweave what the fates have spun. With Achilles came his companion Patroclus, exiled from his homeland for the blood he had spilled, yet bound to Achilles by a love stronger than brotherhood. Together they joined the gathering host at Aulis, where ships waited on the shore and omens whispered through the windless sky. And so, the two final pieces were placed upon the board, the mind and the might, the cunning of Ithaca and the fury of Phthia. The war had its heroes. The gods had chosen their sides in silence, and still the sea held its breath. The storm was ready, though the first wave had not yet broken. The ships stood waiting at Aulis, row upon row of black hulls drawn upon the shore, their sails furled, their masts rising like a forest of dead trees against the sky. Thousands of warriors had gathered, kings and their armies, servants and seers, horses and weapons, all assembled with purpose and fury. But the sea remained still. The winds would not come. Days turned to weeks, and the tide did not change. The oarsmen watched the horizon. The soldiers grew restless. The gods, it seemed, had turned their faces away. Then came Calchas, high priest and seer, his eyes clouded with the visions of Apollo. He told them that the goddess Artemis had been offended, her wrath stirred by blood and arrogance. Some say Agamemnon had boasted he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. Others speak of a sacred stag slain upon her altar, or of an unoffered prayer. The cause mattered little. The silence of Artemis had become the chain that bound the ships to the sand, and only blood, the seer said, could unbind it. The winds would not return unless Agamemnon gave his daughter to the goddess. Her name was Iphigenia. Agamemnon, who had called all Greece to arms, who had claimed the mantle of High King and sought eternal renown, now stood before a choice that would haunt his name forever. Refuse the gods and see the army scatter, the war undone before it began, or sacrifice his own blood to satisfy the divine. There was no right choice, only consequences. He sent for her under a lie. A letter was written to Clytemnestra, the queen of Mycenae, summoning mother and daughter to Aulis under the pretense of a wedding. Achilles, it was said, would take Iphigenia as his bride. The gods had favored the match. The union would bless the war effort. There was joy in the palace at the news, and Iphigenia came willingly, dressed in white, her hair bound in ribbons, dreaming of love and honor. But there was no altar of marriage waiting for her. There was only a pyre and a blade, and the heavy silence of soldiers who could not meet her eyes. When the truth was revealed, some say she wept. Others say she stood tall and proud, that she understood the weight of her sacrifice and embraced it like a heroine of old. There are those who claim Artemis spared her in the final moment, whisking her away in a cloud and placing a stag upon the altar instead. But that is a gentler tale, meant for children and bards. What most believe, what the winds remember, is that she died in the name of war, that her father gave his daughter to the gods so that he could lead 1,000 ships to Troy. And with her blood, the winds returned. They came as a whisper first, then a rising cry. The sails were raised, the anchors lifted, the Greek army moved at last, the sea now open before them, the war no longer a promise, but a certainty. Behind them, the shore of Aulis faded into mist. Before them, the towers of Troy stood waiting. At last, the winds rose over Aulis. They came not in sudden fury, but in a long breath that stirred the sea like a sleeper waking from uneasy dreams. The sails filled slowly at first, then billowed with strength. The air smelled of salt and faraway promises. 1,000 ships, more than any army had ever gathered beneath one cause, now lined the shore like an invasion of shadows. Their hulls were pitched in dark resin, their oars strong and many, their prows carved with lions and eagles and snarling beasts. And within each vessel waited men who would soon become dust and legend. The war had begun not with fire, but with a girl's last breath. Now, with that debt paid and the sea in motion, the fleet departed. It was a sight few would ever see again in their lifetimes. Kings stood on their decks, eyes narrowed against the glare of the open water. Soldiers whispered prayers to gods they barely trusted. Some wept for home. Others gripped their spears and thought only of glory. From every island and coastline of Greece, they had come. Rough men from the north, sleek-armed fighters from the Aegean shores, veteran lords of cities that no longer exist except in the fading lines of song. At the head of the fleet was Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae, his ship marked with a crimson banner, his eyes fixed on a future drenched in ambition. Menelaus sailed beside him, not with hunger for power, but with the heavy rage of a wronged husband. Odysseus kept to himself, his eyes scanning the horizon as though already plotting the paths home. Nestor, aged and calm, murmured lessons of older wars to the youth at his side. Ajax the Greater stood at the bow of his ship like a living statue, unmoved and ready. Diomedes polished his armor with grim determination, and Achilles, barely more than a boy, burned with restless energy, golden and reckless, the promise of death veiled in beauty. The journey to Troy was not without trouble. The sea, though now open, was not always kind. Storms broke from the east and scattered parts of the fleet. Some ships were driven far off course. Some were wrecked on alien shores. The army did not land in unison, and the first to reach Asia did so without clear knowledge of the land or its people. At one point, they mistook the shores of Mysia for Troy and attacked, only to face the fierce resistance of King Telephus. He fought bravely and wounded Achilles before being struck down. His wound, touched by the very spear that inflicted it, could not heal, and only later would he learn that the cure lay within the same weapon. But that part of the tale, like so many in this war, would unfold in time. When the Greeks at last reached the coast of Troy, they found not an undefended port, but a fortified kingdom surrounded by thick walls of stone, gates forged with ancient craft, and towers that watched the sea with caution and suspicion. Troy did not tremble. It did not panic. It had heard whispers on the wind. Its people had seen omens in the flight of birds and the quiet unease of dogs. They had heard that Helen was the spark, but not the fire. The Greeks made their landing not with stealth, but with thunder. They beached their ships and raised their banners. They formed ranks and let their war horns cry across the hills. The Trojans answered not with surrender, but with their own champions. Hector stood tall among them, proud son of Priam, defender of the city, lion of his people. Paris, whose desire had lit the fuse, watched from behind him, his bow in hand, his heart beating faster than he would admit. And above them all, the gods looked down from Olympus, their attention drawn at last to the mortal drama unfolding below. The war had arrived. It would not end quickly, it would not end cleanly, but it had begun, and all the old oaths, the ancient grudges, and the dreams of men were now bound to it. The storm had broken. The war had not yet begun in earnest, but blood had already been spilled. The sea, once calm and reluctant, had carried the Greek fleet to distant shores, though not all voyages ended where they were meant to. The ships were many, and the coastline vast. Among the first to land were those who mistook Mysia for Troy, and it was there, upon foreign soil and against a king who bore no guilt, that the first true skirmish of the campaign unfolded. Mysia lay inland from the Aegean Sea, a proud and fertile region ruled by King Telephus, son of Heracles. His people lived in peace, far from the intrigues of Troy, untouched by the crimes of Paris. Yet when the Greeks came ashore, seeing foreign walls in the distance, and believing them to be the fabled city of Priam, they did not wait for certainty. Their swords were drawn. The land was raided. The village fires were lit. And so, Telephus answered. He met the invaders not with pleas or surrender, but with the fury of a warrior king descended from divine blood. Mounted upon his chariot, spear in hand, he cut through the Greek ranks with terrible speed. Few could match him in open battle. The Greeks, caught off guard by the resistance, faltered in their advance. In the chaos, it was Achilles who stepped forward. The son of Peleus met Telephus on the field. Two young men of noble birth and fire-tempered blood, their blades flashing beneath the rising sun. They clashed in a storm of bronze and fury. In the struggle, Achilles drove his spear into Telephus's thigh, tearing flesh and sending the king tumbling to the dust. The Greeks withdrew, realizing their mistake, and returned to their ships. The wound, however, lingered. Deep and strange, it would not close. No herb could mend it, no physician soothe it. Days passed, and the pain grew worse. Telephus wandered in fever, the strength draining from his limbs, his pride heavy as iron. His priests and counselors whispered that no mortal healing would suffice. The spear that had pierced him was not merely a weapon. It was touched by destiny, and only that which wounded him could restore him. So Telephus sailed, not as a king returning from victory, but as a suppliant crawling to the enemy's feet. He came to the Greek camp in disguise, hooded and limping, and found Agamemnon and Odysseus seated in war council. There, before the very men who had burned his villages and spilled his blood, Telephus laid down his sword and begged not for mercy, but for life. It was Calchas, the seer, who spoke the truth. The wound could only be healed by the hand or weapon that had made it. Achilles, upon hearing this, agreed to help, not out of cruelty or guilt, but because he understood the weight of prophecy and the bonds of fate. Scraping rust from the point of his spear, he applied it to the wound. The bleeding stopped, the skin began to mend, and Telephus stood once more. Gratitude in the ancient world was never offered lightly, especially by kings. In exchange for his healing, Telephus promised knowledge. Though he had no loyalty to Troy, he knew the lay of the lands, the tides, the inlets, and the roadways. He would guide the Greek fleet, show them the true path, and in doing so, lead them at last to the gates of Troy. So the Greeks learned their first lesson of the war. Not all battles would be won by strength. Not every enemy would remain an enemy. And not every road to Troy would be straight. Even now, the gods watched. Even now, the web thickened. And the war, though still young, was learning to speak in the voice of tragedy. Guided at last by Telephus, the Greeks set their sails for the shores of Troy, not with haste, but with a solemn weight. The sea stretched wide and endless before them, but the coastlines no longer misled them. They passed the familiar coves and headlands, and entered waters they had only heard of in stories. At the mouth of the Scamander River, where the earth rose into slopes and the horizon revealed the glimmer of high stone walls, they saw Troy for the first time. The city stood proud upon the plain, its towers tall and unyielding, its gates closed but not afraid. Smoke rose from its hearths, and its banners fluttered against the pale sky, untouched by fear. The Greeks had come at last, but Troy did not tremble. The landing was swift and brutal. The beach was open, but the defense was not idle. The Trojans had watched the horizon and seen the sails long before the keels scraped the sand. Their archers rained arrows upon the shore, and their champions came forth with spear and shield to meet the invaders before they could entrench. The first to fall was Protesilaus, lord of Phyllis, who had leapt from his ship before any other, eager to be first upon Trojan soil. In doing so, he fulfilled a prophecy that the first Greek to set foot on land would be the first to die. His death was remembered not for the battle it marked, but for the omen it carried. This would not be a swift campaign. The gods had taken their share from the very beginning. The Greeks pushed inland and clashed with the outer defences, but Troy itself remained closed to them. The walls, ancient and massive, had been built with divine hands, some whispered with the aid of Poseidon himself. Behind them, Priam ruled with wisdom and sorrow, and Hector stood ready, the pride of his people, beloved by all. Paris, whose desires had brought this fire to their gates, lingered in the shadows of the palace, handsome and hesitant, his bow untouched in its case. Helen stood on the walls and looked down upon the men who had once been her countrymen. She said little. No one knew what her eyes revealed. The Greeks, unable to take the city by storm, turned to the countryside. And so began the long war, not with the thunder of siege towers, but with raids and fire. Towns allied to Troy were sacked. Fertile fields were burned, shepherds were slain, and temples looted. The Greeks set up camp along the coast and sent their warriors into the surrounding lands. It was not a war of glory, but of attrition. The cities of Cilicia and Phrygia felt the wrath of Achilles and his myrmidons, swift-footed and merciless. Briseis, the girl who would soon become the symbol of pride and fury, was taken during one of these raids, her fate sealed long before she stepped into the Greek camp. For 9 years the war dragged on, not against Troy itself, but against its allies and vassals. Troy stood like a rock in the tide, untouched while the world around it bled. The Greeks grew restless. Heroes grew in fame or fell in obscurity. Some, like Ajax, proved themselves in open combat. Others, like Odysseus, schemed in silence. And some, like Achilles, shone with such fierce brilliance that even the gods watched with unease. The war had begun in earnest, but its heart still beat behind the gates of Troy. The plains grew red with blood, and yet the walls endured. The Greeks had crossed the sea for glory, for vengeance, and for the face of a woman. Now, they found themselves trapped by time, by the stubborn will of a city, and by the cruel indifference of the gods who had lured them into war. And so the years passed, not with victory, but with waiting. Waiting for the moment when the tide would turn, and the gates of Troy would finally crack. By the 10th year of the war, the plain before Troy had become a graveyard of heroes. The walls of the city still held firm, and the Greeks, for all their ships and swords, had not yet breached them. The tide of battle shifted with the seasons. Some years brought skirmishes and victories. Others were filled with illness and windless days. The gods gave and withheld their favor like gamblers tossing bones across a table. And in the long shadow of that unbroken stalemate, tempers flared, rivalries deepened, and pride began to fester. Among the Greeks, no name burned brighter than Achilles, the son of Peleus, and the sea goddess Thetis. No man could match his speed in battle or his fury in the clash of arms. His myrmidons, fierce and loyal, followed him like hounds behind a lion. When Achilles took the field, men died quickly, and cities fell in his wake. He had sacked 12 strongholds along the coast, and carried their spoils back to the camp, with little regard for strategy or politics. He fought not for Agamemnon, nor for Menelaus, but for glory, for his own legend, and for the unspoken knowledge that his time in the world would not be long. It was during one of those raids that Briseis was taken. A princess of Lyrnessus, wife to a slain priest and daughter of noble blood, she was given to Achilles as a prize. But what began as a gift soon became something more. Achilles kept her in his tent, not as a servant, but as a companion, and the men whispered that the great warrior had found affection, even tenderness, within the rage that so often consumed him. Briseis said little, and history does not record her feelings with certainty, but those who saw them together said that Achilles grew softer in her presence, as if some part of him remembered the world before war. Agamemnon, meanwhile, brooded in the heart of the camp. Though he was the High King and commander of all the Greek forces, he knew that his command rested uneasily upon the shoulders of men who did not love him. His pride was vast, but his greatness was not absolute. He envied Achilles, resented the love the soldiers bore him, and feared the way his fame threatened to outshine that of every other Greek. When his own prize, the daughter of a Trojan priest named Chryseis, was taken from him by the will of Apollo, Agamemnon's rage turned not against the gods, but against the one man in camp whom he could not control. He demanded Briseis. The act was bold and cruel, not because he desired the girl, but because he wished to wound the pride of Achilles. And the wound was deep. Achilles did not draw his sword, though many feared he would. He did not strike Agamemnon, though his hand trembled with the urge. Instead, he withdrew. He left the battlefield and returned to his ships. He vowed not to raise his spear again in this war, not for Helen, not for Agamemnon, not for any cause born of lies and arrogance. Without Achilles, the Greeks faltered. They did not know it yet, but they had lost more than a warrior. They had lost their fire. And in the silence that followed his retreat, the war began to shift. The balance tilted, and the gods watching from Olympus began to smile. The years had worn down the men, but pride had not softened. In the shadow of stalemate, bitterness grew, and even the mightiest of warriors began to turn their faces away from the war they had once chased like a dream. With Achilles withdrawn to his tent, and the Myrmidons idle beside their ships, the war fell into a strange quiet. The Greeks still held their camp upon the beach, and sent out small raids into the surrounding countryside, but the heart of their army no longer beat with strength. The Trojans, sensing the shift, began to press outward beyond their walls. Where once they had remained cautious, now they grew bolder. Skirmishes erupted along the plain, and more than once the Greeks were pushed back toward the sea, their fortifications tested, their courage questioned. The absence of Achilles did not go unnoticed within the halls of Troy. Priam, old and wise, urged caution. He had lived long enough to know that fortune changes faster than wind on the water. But Hector, his eldest son and the city's greatest defender, saw in the withdrawal an opportunity to press the enemy, to remind the Greeks that Troy still had teeth. Hector had no illusions about the war. He did not crave it, nor take joy in killing. He fought for his city, for his wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax, for the old king who still sat the throne, and for the gods who watched silently from the heights of Mount Ida. With Achilles gone from the field, Hector struck with swift precision. He led attacks not only against the Greek lines, but deep into the enemy's morale. To halt this growing threat, the Greeks turned to diplomacy. Odysseus, ever the master of words, was sent with Phoenix and Ajax to plead with Achilles. They found him in his tent, surrounded by stillness, his armor untouched, his spear leaning against the wall like a relic of a forgotten self. He listened as they spoke. He heard their arguments, their flattery, their promises of wealth and glory. They begged him to return, to save the Greeks from ruin, to reclaim the honor stolen by Agamemnon. But Achilles, though moved, did not rise. He spoke of betrayal, of a heart made cold by insult, of a war no longer worth the blood it cost. He would not fight, not for Agamemnon, and perhaps not even for Greece. Meanwhile, the war outside his tent grew crueler. Without Achilles, the Greeks were vulnerable, and the Trojans grew more daring. Sarpedon, son of Zeus and king of Lycia, arrived with his forces and struck terror into the enemy lines. He fought like a man who knew the hour of his death but cared nothing for it. Aeneas too proved himself, cousin to Hector and Paris, and a warrior who would one day carry the last ember of Troy far to the west. The gods took sides in secret and in open. Athena guided the spear arms of the Greeks. Apollo stood beside the Trojans. Hera whispered fury into the hearts of commanders. Artemis and Ares chose their favorites without warning. The battlefield had become a game board, and men were the pieces moved by divine hands. Within both camps, losses mounted. Young men who had come for glory now lay nameless in the dust. Ships that had once cut through the Aegean, like birds on the wind, now served as funeral pyres. The plains around Troy grew thick with blood and salt, and the smell of unwashed sorrow. The Greeks lost many, and the Trojans mourned just as deeply. Brothers fell beside brothers. Champions were struck down before their names could be remembered. The war was no longer a tale of shining shields and noble duels. It had become a long decay. Through it all, Achilles remained apart, his grief and rage sealed behind silence. He walked the shore at dawn, speaking to no one. And within Troy, Helen watched from the walls, her eyes tracing the lines of the horizon, searching for something no one could name. Years had passed since Paris had carried her from Sparta. The songs still called her the cause of the war, but those close to her saw something else. Not a seductress, but a prisoner. Not a prize, but a wound that refused to close. She moved through the palace like a ghost, speaking softly to Priam, keeping distance from Paris, and listening to the names of the dead with an expression that never changed. The war had not reached its climax, but the weight of it had settled across the land like ash. Heroes still stood, and gods still watched. But both sides had begun to understand what kind of war they were truly fighting. Not a swift campaign for honor and retribution, but a slow unraveling of pride, a hunger that could not be fed, a fire that would not go out. And far from the walls of Troy, deep within the soul of the greatest warrior Greece had ever known, something dark was stirring. It began not with shouting, nor with sword in hand, but with silence. Achilles, son of Thetis and prince of Phthia, had withdrawn from battle, and with him went the hope of swift victory. The Myrmidons remained idle beside their ships, their black armor polished and unused, while their commander walked the shore alone, each step a quiet rebellion against the war he had once pursued with fire in his blood. The Greeks begged for his return, but their pleas fell like waves upon stone. He would not raise his spear. He would not fight for a king who had dishonored him. For Achilles, glory was nothing without pride, and his pride had been taken. In the camp, the Greeks faltered. Hector and the Trojans pressed hard upon their lines. The gods gave strength to the city's defenders, and the tide of war shifted once more. Where once the Greeks had dominated the plain, now they were driven back toward the sea. Even the ships, the great vessels that had carried them across the wine-dark waters, now stood threatened by fire and storm. Agamemnon, proud and wrathful, watched his army bend beneath the weight of his own folly. Still, he would not yield to Achilles, not fully, and so the Greeks fought on, diminished and desperate. It was Patroclus who could no longer bear to watch. Friend and companion to Achilles, bound by affection deeper than most men knew how to speak, he had sat beside him through the long days of idleness, through the restless pacing and the anger that cooled into sorrow. But Patroclus was not made for inaction. He saw the dying men, heard the cries at the ramparts, and watched the Trojans draw nearer with every passing day. Finally, he went to Achilles and fell to his knees. "Let me wear your armor," he said. "Let me lead the Myrmidons. The Trojans will believe you have returned. The sight of your shield alone will drive them back. I do not ask you to fight, only to let me stand in your place." Achilles hesitated. He looked upon his friend and saw both courage and the shadow of fate. He had known since childhood that his own end would come before the war's conclusion. He had not foreseen this, but he agreed. He gave Patroclus his armor, his horses, and command of the Myrmidons. He warned him, "Do not chase them to the gates. Drive them from the ships, but go no farther." Patroclus rode out gleaming like the morning star. The Myrmidons followed with a roar, and the Trojans, thinking Achilles himself had returned, broke ranks in fear. The Greek camp surged with renewed spirit. The ships were saved. The lines were restored. Patroclus, burning with borrowed fire, pushed forward. He forgot the warning. He chased the fleeing Trojans across the plain, through the bloodied earth and broken shields, until at last he stood beneath the walls of Troy. There, he met Hector. When the body was brought back, the silence returned. But it was no longer the stillness of retreat. It was the silence before a storm, before the world is broken and remade in fire. Achilles wept. He threw dust upon his head and fell beside his friend's body. He wept not as a hero, but as a man. No pride remained, no grudge with Agamemnon, only grief, cold and vast, and the slow burning of a vengeance that would not be denied. He rose, called his mother Thetis from the sea, and begged for new armor. He would return to battle. He would not live long. But before he died, Hector would fall, and all the rage of the gods could not prevent it. Hephaestus, the smith of Olympus, forged for Achilles a shield unlike any seen before or since. Upon its surface were etched the labors of men, the songs of harvest and war, the quiet of cities and the chaos of storms. It was not merely a shield, but a world made of bronze. With it, Achilles returned to the field, and the earth trembled beneath his feet. He fought not for Helen, nor for Greece, but for Patroclus. His spear found every Trojan it sought. Men fled before him as before a god. The Scamander River rose against him, offended by the bodies that choked its banks, but even the waters could not stop him. He raged like fire, like a curse that could not be lifted. At last, he met Hector beneath the walls of Troy. The duel was not like those of old when honor guided the spear. Hector stood his ground, but he knew his end had come. 3 times they circled the city. 3 times Hector fled, until at last Athena, in the guise of Hector's brother, deceived him and stopped his flight. He turned and faced Achilles. The two clashed beneath the cold eye of the gods, and Achilles struck the killing blow, driving his spear through the collarbone and into the dust. Even then, Hector spoke with dignity. He begged that his body be returned to his family, that it not be defiled. But Achilles, lost in rage, refused. He bound Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it through the dirt before the city's weeping eyes. He had avenged Patroclus, but he had also stepped beyond the line that separates men from beasts. Days passed. The anger cooled, though the grief remained. It was not until old Priam, king of Troy and father to Hector, came alone into the Greek camp, unarmed and weeping, that Achilles' heart was moved again. The old man knelt before him, kissed his hands, and begged for the return of his son's body. "Think of your own father," he said. "Think of what it is to love a child and lose him." And Achilles, in that moment, saw the truth. He wept again. He returned Hector's body, and for a brief moment, the war stood still. But it would not end. Not yet. Too much had been done. Too many fires still burned. Achilles had found his wrath, and soon he would meet his fate. There are few deaths in the long story of the Trojan War that echo louder than that of Patroclus. His name was not born for kingship, nor did he command great armies of his own, but he stood closer to Achilles than any other living soul. Bound by youth and exile, by shared silence and deep affection, Patroclus was the only man who could still reach the heart of the greatest warrior of Greece. In a war ruled by pride and vengeance, his was the voice that still spoke of compassion, of honor, not twisted by rage. And it was that voice and that heart that were lost when he fell beneath the walls of Troy. The war had dragged itself into its 10th year, and the Greeks were breaking. Achilles remained away from the field, unmoved by Agamemnon's gifts, untouched by the pleas of kings. Each day the Trojans came closer to the ships. Each day the smoke rose higher above the camp. Men who had once sailed with dreams of swift glory now stood shoulder to shoulder in the dirt, waiting for death. Hector was relentless. The gates of Troy, once shut to all but a few, now opened daily to let its warriors spill out across the plain. The Greeks had lost their fiercest sword, and they knew it. Patroclus watched from the sidelines, unable to stand the sound of dying men. When the flames reached the first of the ships, and the enemy closed in with fire in their hands, he could bear it no longer. He went to Achilles and begged not for blood, but for a chance to save lives. "Let me wear your armor," he said. "Let me lead the Myrmidons just once. Let them believe you have returned and they will flee. I do not seek glory, only the chance to stop this tide." Achilles, moved by grief but still chained by his fury, agreed. But he gave a warning. "Drive them from the ships. Do not pursue them to the walls. Come back when the danger is past. Your life is not meant for the gates of Troy." Patroclus took the armor. He mounted the chariot. He called the Myrmidons to arms. They followed him as they would have followed Achilles, for they saw the same shield, the same crest, and they heard the same voice raised not in command, but in duty. The Trojans saw him too, and for a moment they believed the storm had returned. They broke. They ran. Hector fell back. The fire was driven from the ships, and the Greeks surged forward with hope reborn. But Patroclus, caught in the rush of battle and the scent of victory, forgot the warning. Or perhaps he remembered it too late. The blood of warriors now covered his borrowed armor. He had slain Sarpedon, son of Zeus, in single combat, a deed worthy of the greatest heroes. He had driven the Trojans nearly to the gates. There, in the dust outside the city, he stood face to face with fate. Apollo struck him first. The god came unseen, a sudden force that knocked the helmet from his head and left him exposed. His spear was shattered, his limbs faltered. Then Euphorbus wounded him with a blow of the spear. And finally, Hector came, proud and unflinching, and drove the final weapon through Patroclus's belly. As he died, Patroclus spoke, not with hatred, but with warning. "You have killed me, but it was not your doing alone. You will not live long, Hector. Achilles waits for you. You have taken from him what he loved most. He will come for you." The body was taken from the field, fought over like a sacred prize. Men died to recover it. Ajax and Menelaus carried it back through the lines, retreating inch by inch beneath a hail of arrows and spears. When at last they reached the camp, they laid Patroclus upon a bier before the tent of Achilles. The warrior said nothing. He fell to the earth, tore his hair, and poured ash upon his head. He wept, not as a soldier, but as a man who had lost the last good part of himself. His armor was gone, his friend was gone, and the rage that had kept him from battle now burned in a different shape. It was no longer pride. It was no longer the insult of Agamemnon or the politics of kings. It was grief, cold and clear, and it called for blood. Achilles swore then to return to the battlefield. He swore to kill Hector. He swore that the pyre of Patroclus would not be lit until it was fed with Trojan captives. He swore that he would meet his own fate without fear, so long as vengeance was done first. The sea goddess Thetis rose from the waves to comfort her son, but even she could not turn him from the path ahead. She knew what the gods had already spoken. If he returned to battle, he would die. But she did not stop him. Instead, she went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and begged for new armor to replace what Hector had taken. The god forged a shield unlike any the world had ever seen, bearing on its surface not only the emblems of war, but of peace and cities and harvests, and the full round of mortal life. It was a shield for a man who would never live to see such things again. Achilles took up the armor. He stood before the Greeks, radiant and terrible, and declared that the time of silence was ended. Patroclus would be avenged. The war would burn once more, and Troy would tremble beneath the weight of his wrath. And the gods, watching from above, said nothing. The dawn that followed the death of Patroclus was unlike any that had come before it. It rose not with hope, but with the heavy silence of a battlefield that knew what was coming. The Greeks stirred in their tents and sharpened their spears, but their eyes turned always toward one figure. Achilles stood at the edge of the camp, staring across the plain toward the walls of Troy. The man who had once refused to fight now burned with purpose. He had not returned to the war for gold or honor, nor to redeem the insults of Agamemnon. He had returned for vengeance, and vengeance would be his only guide. The new armor gleamed with divine fire. Hephaestus, the smith of Olympus, had wrought it not only with skill, but with the knowledge that it would soon be soaked in blood. The shield bore images of life untouched by war, a cruel irony in the hands of a man who had nothing left but war itself. When Achilles strapped it to his arm, it was as though the old world had fallen away and only fate remained. He did not wait for permission. He did not call counsel or speak to kings. He walked to the field like a man entering his own funeral, fearless and alone. The Trojans saw him from their towers, and dread spread through their ranks like fire through dry grass. Even before he struck, they felt the weight of his return. He was not merely a warrior. He was the storm the gods had held back, now loosed at last. Achilles led the charge, and the Myrmidons followed without question. The plain erupted in violence. Trojan chariots turned and fled. Men who had stood firm against 10 years of siege now faltered at the sight of one man. His spear found its mark again and again. He moved not with rage, but with cold precision. There was no mercy in him. He was seeking a single name, but any who stood in his way were swept aside like dust before the wind. He found Aeneas and spared him only at the urging of the gods. He found Lycaon, son of Priam, whom he had once captured and sold into slavery. The boy had returned to Troy only to meet the same man who had once let him live. This time, Achilles did not. He struck him down without pause, unmoved by the boy's tears or pleas. He killed Troilus at the altar. He dammed the river with corpses until the waters rose in anger, and the god Scamander himself rose against him. Even then, Achilles did not yield. He fought the river as he fought men, fearless and unrelenting, until the gods pulled him away from the rising flood. The Greeks rejoiced, but none more than Achilles. He had become what he was always meant to be, not a king, not a husband, but a weapon sharpened by sorrow and wielded by the will of fate. And at the heart of his fury stood one name, Hector. The Prince of Troy had withdrawn behind the gates, urging his men to retreat, to live and fight another day. But the city was in chaos. Priam's sons had died in the dust, and the plain outside the walls was stained with blood. Hector knew what was coming. He donned his armor, kissed his wife Andromache, and lifted his son Astyanax into the air one final time. She begged him not to face Achilles. She spoke not of glory, but of the life they had built, of the quiet garden within the palace, of the games their son played in the courtyard. But Hector had no choice. He was the shield of Troy, and without him the city would fall. He walked alone onto the plain and stood beneath the walls. Achilles saw him, and his steps slowed. There, at last, was the man who had taken Patroclus. The two locked eyes, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Hector turned and ran. Around the walls of Troy they circled, not once, but 3 times. Hector's courage failed him, and his feet betrayed him, but the gods would not let the chase last forever. Athena appeared in the guise of Hector's brother and urged him to stop, promising help. Deceived and cornered, Hector turned and faced his enemy. The duel was swift and inevitable. Hector fought bravely, but Achilles was beyond mortal strength. The spear flew true, and Hector fell. As he lay dying, he begged not for life, but for dignity. "Return my body to my father," he said. "Let me be buried with honor." But Achilles had not yet returned to himself. His grief still guided him. He refused. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust before the eyes of Troy. Andromache screamed from the walls. Priam wept in silence. Paris said nothing. Helen turned away. That night, Achilles held funeral games for Patroclus. He lit the pyre with his own hands. He threw the hair he had grown long into the flames and wept as the body burned. The Greeks gathered to compete in chariot races and spear throws, but no celebration could ease the weight of what had been lost. Achilles sat apart, the fire reflected in his eyes, and the body of Hector still lay unburied. It was not until Priam, aged and bent with grief, entered the Greek camp in secret that the final act of wrath came to an end. The old king knelt before the killer of his son, kissed his hands, and spoke the simplest truth. "I have done what no man has done. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my child." Achilles looked upon him and saw not a king, but a father. He thought of Peleus, old and waiting in Phthia, and he broke. He returned the body. He washed it with his own hands. He gave it back to Priam and promised 12 days of peace for the burial. That night, in the quiet of his tent, Achilles wept again. For Patroclus, for Hector, for the boy he had once been. He knew his time was short. He knew the gods would come for him. But for a moment, there was peace. The war paused. The fires burned low, and across the plains of Troy, even the wind seemed to mourn. The plains of Troy had not known quiet in many years, but after the death of Hector, the battlefield fell into stillness. The clash of swords, the whistling of arrows, the thunder of hooves upon broken earth, all of it faded. The Greeks stood behind their walls of ship timber, and the Trojans watched from their towers, but neither side raised their hands. It was not a truce sealed by words or treaties, but one born from the weight of grief. Even war must rest when the greatest defenders lie cold and unburied. In the Greek camp, Achilles remained beside the pyre of Patroclus. The fire had burned for hours, smoke twisting into the sky, carrying the soul of his dearest companion to whatever realm awaited the honored dead. Ash clung to Achilles' skin, and his eyes were red from weeping. Around him, the warriors of Greece moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Funeral games had been held, and the spoils of war had been given as prizes, but none could lift the shadow that had settled over the camp. Achilles had avenged Patroclus, but he had not found peace. The body of Hector still lay within his tent, bound and bruised, and each morning Achilles rose and dragged it behind his chariot around the tomb of his friend. And yet the body did not rot. Day after day, Achilles desecrated the corpse, and yet Hector's flesh did not decay. Apollo had shielded it with divine light, preserving the face of Troy's fallen champion as if to remind the Greeks that even in death, Hector remained a prince. The gods had begun to turn their eyes away from Achilles, not in judgment, but in sorrow. Even Zeus, who had watched the war with detachment and amusement, now stirred. It was time for the wrath to end. That end came in the quietest of ways. Late one night, an old man rode alone into the Greek camp. Priam, king of Troy, father to Hector, passed through the gates unseen, guided by Hermes himself. He was unarmed, cloaked in simple robes, his beard grey with age, his back bent under the weight of years and sorrow. He carried no threats, no arguments, no gold worth the blood of 10 years. What he carried was the memory of a son, and the courage that only grief can summon. He found Achilles in his tent, alone with his sorrow. The warrior did not rise when the old man entered. He did not call for guards or draw his sword. He looked upon Priam and saw not an enemy, but something far more painful, a mirror. Priam knelt before him, lowered his head, and kissed the hands that had killed his son. "I have done what no man should ever have to do," he said. "I have kissed the hands of the man who slaughtered my child." Achilles said nothing for a long time. The silence stretched like a wound. Then he wept. He wept for Hector, whom he had wronged. He wept for Patroclus, whom he had lost. He wept for his own father, Peleus, who waited far away in Phthia, never to see his son return. The grief of the old and the young mingled in that quiet tent, and for the first time since the ships had landed on Trojan shores, there was something like mercy. Achilles rose and lifted Priam from the earth. He washed Hector's body with his own hands. He anointed it with oil and wrapped it in linen. He returned the Prince of Troy to his father, not as a trophy, but as a man who had fought and died with honor. He promised 12 days of peace for the burial rites. No spear would fly, no sword would be drawn. The war, for a brief moment, had paused. Priam returned to the city with his son's body. The gates of Troy opened in silence. Men and women lined the streets, their heads bowed. Andromache fell to the earth when she saw him, her hands pressed to her mouth, her hair falling loose. Hecuba, the queen, tore at her veil. Even Paris, for once, said nothing. Helen stood above them all, silent in her sorrow, and none dared to blame her, for the grief in her eyes was deeper than any wound. The Trojans buried Hector with all the rights owed to a prince, They built his pyre high and placed upon it fine robes and gold and weapons that would never again see battle. Priam lit the flame himself. And for 12 days the fires burned and the weeping echoed through the city. No Greek crossed the plain. No Trojan looked beyond the walls. Even the gods, so long entangled in the threads of this war, stood still. Hector was gone. Patroclus was gone. The greatest of warriors had met, and one had fallen. But this was not the end. Troy still stood. Achilles still breathed. And though the fires of mourning glowed for now, they would soon give way to blood once more. The war, like grief, does not end because we are tired of it. It ends only when it has taken everything. After the burial of Hector, there was silence in the air, as if the very earth had taken a breath. The flames on his pyre had burned high into the sky, their light dancing upon the faces of soldiers who had not known peace for years. For a moment, grief had made both sides human again, but the gods are never still for long, and neither are men. The truce passed, the mourning ended, and the war, like a beast too long restrained, stirred once more. Achilles had returned to battle, but fate had already marked him. From the moment he stepped back onto the field, with the shield of the world on his arm and fire in his eyes, every god who watched the war knew what would follow. Thetis had tried to hide him from this doom once, disguising him, shielding him, even pleading with the immortals to spare her son. But Achilles had chosen glory, and glory was never given without blood. It was Paris who struck the blow, but few called it a victory. The Prince of Troy, guided by Apollo, loosed an arrow from the walls, and the god carried it to its mark. It found Achilles' heel, the only place untouched by the river Styx, where Thetis had held him as an infant. The arrow pierced the flesh, and the greatest of the Greeks fell. He did not die in the heat of battle, surrounded by foes, as many expected. He died with the gods watching, with the dust rising slowly around him, and with the knowledge that his name would live even as his body faded. The Greeks carried him from the field in silence. There were no cheers, only the sound of mourning, heavy and low. They burned him on a great pyre, as they had Patroclus, and mixed their ashes together. It was said that their souls were joined in death as they had been in life. A tomb was raised on the shores of Troy, a mound so high that passing ships could see it and remember the wrath and glory of the son of Thetis. With Achilles gone, the Greeks mourned not only the man, but the future they had imagined with him. He had been more than a warrior. He had been their shield, their terror, their hope. Without him, the tide of war faltered once more, but there were still those who fought, and those who burned with rival flames. The armor of Achilles, forged by Hephaestus and now stained with his blood, became a prize. It was offered as an honor to the most worthy warrior remaining. 2 men stood to claim it. Ajax, the towering son of Telamon, strong and steady as a mountain, and Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, whose words had won as many battles as his blade. A council of chiefs was called. They listened not to feats of strength, but to speeches. Odysseus spoke with elegance and memory, weaving the tale of his service, reminding the Greeks of his cunning and his courage, of the night raids and ambushes, of the walls he had scaled and the men he had rescued. Ajax spoke simply, pointing to the shield he had carried beside Achilles, to the wounds on his flesh, to the loyalty he had never questioned. But the Greeks chose Odysseus. Ajax did not protest. He left the camp and walked into the night, but shame grew in him like a sickness. In the darkness, his mind clouded. He saw enemies where there were none. He drew his sword and slew a herd of cattle, believing them to be the men who had mocked him. When the madness faded and he saw what he had done, he fell upon his own blade. Thus died the strongest of the Greeks, not by the spear of a Trojan, but by the weight of pride and the silence of despair. Others followed. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, came to Troy after Hector's death, seeking to honor his memory and to test her strength. She rode into battle with the grace of a dancer and the fury of a storm. The Trojans welcomed her, and for a brief moment, hope returned to their hearts. But Achilles had left a shadow, and none could escape it. Penthesilea met death at the hands of the Greeks, struck down by Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, who had come to the war after his father's fall, bearing his fury like an inheritance. Then came Memnon, son of the dawn, a prince from distant lands, tall and golden, with a spear like sunlight and a host of warriors behind him. He challenged the Greeks, and his presence brought awe even among enemies. But he too was destined to fall, slain in single combat. The gods mourned him. His mother Eos wept, and her tears fell upon the earth as morning dew. One by one, the champions died. Names that had once stirred songs now lay broken beneath the walls of Troy. The war no longer belonged to heroes. It belonged to time and to sorrow. The plain before Troy had been redrawn in blood so many times that the earth no longer remembered the green it once wore. Graves rose beside the ships. Mounds of stone marked the dead, but there were never enough stones, nor enough names. The war had burned for so long that it had ceased to be a battle for Helen or for honor. It had become a burden neither side could lay down. Even the gods, who had once pulled the strings of fate with pleasure and intrigue, now watched with weary silence. And yet, there were still prophecies to fulfill. Troy would not fall by strength alone. Its doom had been written in riddles. The Greeks, desperate for resolution, turned to the seers once more. Calchas, the priest who had long served as the voice of Apollo in their camp, spoke of hidden truths that must be unearthed if the city was to fall. Troy was protected not only by its walls or its warriors, but by sacred relics and fate-bound names. Without certain conditions met, the city would never yield. These prophecies were not new, but they had been forgotten in the rage of war. Now, with so many heroes dead and the siege dragging into its final years, they were remembered again. The first was the need for Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. It was foretold that the bloodline of the greatest warrior must return to Troy to complete what his father had begun. And so Odysseus and Phoenix sailed to Syros, the island where Thetis had once hidden her son. They found Neoptolemus not as a boy, but as a youth already marked by the legacy he carried. He was not his father, but the shadow of Achilles clung to him. He returned with them willingly, bearing new armor, eager to step into the place where his name had been carved before he was born. When he arrived at Troy, the Greeks looked upon him with hope and with fear. For it was said that he would bring the war to its end, but that his hands would be stained with cruelty as well as glory. The second prophecy spoke of the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena hidden within the city walls. As long as the Palladium remained in Troy, the city would never fall. It had been a gift from the gods in ancient times, a symbol of divine protection. To steal it would be to strip Troy of its soul. Odysseus, ever the trickster, took on the task. With Diomedes at his side, he crept beneath the cover of night and scaled the walls of the city. They found the statue hidden deep within a temple and took it from its pedestal. The theft was quiet, without blood, But when the Trojans awoke and found it gone, they knew something had shifted. A part of the city had died in the darkness, and though the walls still stood, they no longer had the blessing of the gods. The final piece of prophecy spoke of a bow and a wound. The bow had once belonged to Heracles, the greatest of all heroes. It had been passed down to Philoctetes, a warrior who had set out with the Greeks at the beginning of the war, but had been abandoned on the island of Lemnos after a venomous snake bite left his legs swollen and foul. The wound had festered, and his cries had driven the others to leave him behind. Now, after so many years, the Greeks remembered him. Calchas declared that only the bow of Heracles could bring death to Paris, and that Troy's fate depended on its return. Odysseus again took to the sea. He found Philoctetes still alive, bitter and wounded, his legs still stinking of rot, his mind filled with hatred for the men who had left him. But he still had the bow, and he still remembered the taste of glory. It was Neoptolemus who softened his heart, not with lies, but with the truth. He told Philoctetes of the war, of Achilles' death, of the heroes who had fallen and those who still fought. Slowly, the fire returned to the old warrior's eyes. He agreed to return. The gods sent Asclepius' sons, the healers, to cleanse the wound, and once again he took up the bow. When they reached Troy, the sky was grey with prophecy. Paris stood atop the battlements, his bow in hand, his face still beautiful and unchanged, but empty of purpose. The man who had once crossed the sea to claim Helen now stood like a ghost. In the battle that followed, Philoctetes loosed his arrow. Guided by fate and the wrath of Heracles, it struck Paris through the belly. He fell, not like a prince, but like a man who had long since exhausted his story. He crawled to the forest, to the home of Oenone, the nymph he had once abandoned. He begged her to heal him, as she once had the power to do, but she refused. He died in silence, and so the man who began the war did not live to see its end. With Neoptolemus now blooded, the Palladium gone, and Paris dead, the final pieces were falling into place. The Greeks stood at the edge of victory, but the walls of Troy still rose, and within them were men who had not yet yielded, women who still sang for their gods, and a city that had withstood a decade of siege. But prophecy, once fulfilled, does not rest. It waits for the last door to open, and that door would soon appear in the shape of wood and silence. The war was nearly done, but the final act, the cruelest and most cunning, had not yet begun. The war had lasted so long that the soldiers on both sides no longer remembered what peace felt like. Children had been born behind Troy's walls who had never seen the world beyond them. The Greeks no longer counted the years since they first set sail from Aulis. The ships that lined the beach had grown weathered with time, their sails patched and their hulls darkened by salt and sun. The fires in the Greek camp still burned, but they did so quietly, not with the roar of confidence, but with the slow, stubborn persistence of men who had given too much to turn back. The fighting had become a rhythm, like the tide or the passing of seasons. Some days brought blood, others brought stillness. The Greeks no longer believed in a quick victory. The Trojans no longer believed in rescue. And the gods, once so active, now stood distant, their attentions turned elsewhere. Perhaps they too had tired of the slaughter. And yet Troy endured. Its walls, high and ancient, still rose above the plain. Its towers still held watch. Though Hector was gone, and Paris too, the city had not fallen. Priam, aged and sorrowful, still ruled from his high palace, Aeneas still led men in battle. Deiphobus, Helenus, and the last princes of the house of Priam still walked the halls. The heart of the city had not broken, not yet. Among the Greeks, doubt began to grow. Men whispered that perhaps the gods had lied, that perhaps Troy could not fall. Some called for retreat, for the slow voyage home. Others dreamed of escape, but stayed out of shame, unwilling to admit they had given 10 years for nothing. It was in this weariness, this despair, that a new thought began to stir. It did not come with trumpets or in dreams, but quietly in the tent of Odysseus. He had watched the war not only with the eyes of a soldier, but with the patience of a hunter. He had studied the city, listened to its messengers, and walked among its prisoners. He knew the walls would not fall to force. Not even Achilles had breached them. And now, with the mightiest gone, no sword could do what needed to be done. But there were other weapons. The idea came slowly, then all at once. A trick. A ruse so bold it would seem madness, yet so elegant it would outlive all the battles that came before. Odysseus did not go to Agamemnon at first. He spoke instead to Epeius, a builder and a craftsman, known more for his tools than for his temper. He told him what to construct: a gift, a hollow monument, a horse, great and gleaming, large enough to hold men within it, built not for war, but for worship. They would make it seem a tribute, an offering to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, a token of retreat, a symbol of surrender. They would burn the camp, break the tents, and sail away, leaving the horse behind as a farewell. And when the Trojans came to claim their victory, they would find what appeared to be a gift from their enemies, and they would bring it within their walls. Inside the horse, soldiers would wait, silent, armed, hidden in wood and darkness. It was madness, it was genius, and it was the only chance they had left. The Greeks did not all agree. Men like Menelaus hesitated. Others doubted it could work, but they were tired, and they had tried everything else. Agamemnon gave his consent. The ships were prepared. The fires were lit. The illusion of retreat began. And the horse, tall and still, began to take shape beside the shore. At dawn, the Greeks vanished. The beach that had once held 1,000 ships was empty. The tents collapsed and smouldering, the trenches abandoned. Smoke drifted through the air where the fires had been extinguished. The sea was calm, the tide slow, and the great ships were gone, hidden behind the curve of the nearby island of Tenedos. Only one thing remained upon the shore, standing tall and strange among the ashes. A great wooden horse, built of smooth beams and carved with care, towered over the battlefield like a relic left behind by gods. Its shape was noble, its flanks round and silent, its face turned toward the city with no expression. The Trojans watched from their walls, first in suspicion, then in wonder. Scouts were sent. No ambush waited, no Greeks stirred. The camp had been abandoned. Some shouted that it was a trap. Others laughed and called it a miracle. They had waited 10 years for this day, and now, without warning, it had come. Priam, grey and trembling, descended from his throne to walk among the ruins. His counselors debated. Some warned caution. One voice among them rose with force. His name was Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, a man who had served the gods faithfully. He stood before the horse and cried out to the people. "Do not trust gifts left behind by your enemies," he said. "There is treachery in silence." He took his spear and hurled it into the side of the wooden beast. It struck the flank with a hollow sound, a drumbeat of danger. but the sound passed over the ears of those who no longer wished to hear. In that same hour, a second sign arrived. A prisoner was dragged before the gates, beaten and bruised, claiming to have been abandoned by the Greeks. His name was Sinon. He was a skilled liar, placed there by Odysseus. He told the Trojans a story of betrayal, of how the Greeks had turned against him and left him behind as punishment. He said the horse was a gift to Athena, meant to protect the Greeks on their journey home. If the Trojans dared to harm it, the goddess would curse them. If they brought it into the city, Troy would rise stronger than ever. His tears were convincing. His voice rang with sorrow, and the people believed. Even the gods seemed to speak in favor of the deception. As Laocoon stood with his sons near the altar of Poseidon, two great serpents rose from the sea, their bodies thick as ship masts, their eyes burning with divine fury. They coiled around Laocoon and his sons and crushed them, dragging their bodies into the surf. The people cried out that the gods had punished him for daring to strike the sacred gift. That was all it took. The gates were opened. The Trojans rolled the horse into the city. They cleared the streets, made space in the square, and pulled it through the Scaean gate, which had withstood every assault but now welcomed in the enemy dressed in silence. The horse stood in the heart of Troy, towering over the temples and palaces. That night, the city filled with celebration. Wine flowed, music rose into the sky, and the people danced beneath the stars. They believed the war was over. They believed the gods had favored them. They believed they had endured. But inside the horse, the Greeks waited. Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, Diomedes, all crouched in silence, their swords at their sides, listening to the distant sound of laughter. And beyond the horizon, the fleet returned under cover of night. Troy slept, and the hour of its death approached. Troy slept, as it had not slept in years. For the first time in a decade, the towers were unmanned and the walls unguarded. The warriors who had fought beneath the blazing sun now rested beside their hearths. Mothers cradled children without fear. Old men drank wine in quiet courtyards, speaking of peace, of survival, of tomorrow. The city had endured what no other had. It had outlasted Agamemnon's pride, Achilles' fury, Hector's fall. The Greeks were gone, the beach was empty, and in the center of the city stood a great wooden horse, still and silent, a gift from enemies now vanished. It seemed a fitting monument to a long and terrible war. But while Troy dreamed, the Greeks moved through the dark. From the sea they came. Oars dipped soundlessly into the waves, sails down, torches covered. The ships returned not with the roar of battle, but with the hush of assassins. They landed once more on the familiar shore, where so many had died and been buried. They knew every curve of the coastline, every stone on the beach. There was no need for light. They could find their way through memory alone. Within the wooden horse, the chosen warriors stirred. They had waited for hours in cramped silence, sweat clinging to their skin, their weapons gripped in weary hands. Then, at last, a signal. Sinon, the liar, the master of this quiet betrayal, crept from his hiding place and opened the belly of the beast. The wooden panel fell, and Odysseus was the first to drop into the square. One by one, the Greeks emerged, shadows among torchlight, moving like phantoms through the sleeping streets. They opened the gates. The army poured into the city. No horns sounded. No declarations were made. The war ended not with a cry, but with a whisper and a scream. The Greeks fell upon the city like fire. They spared no house, no altar, no bed. Children were torn from their mothers, old men cut down as they knelt. The temples were looted, statues shattered, and altars soaked with blood. The gods had been forgotten in the chaos. Only fury remained. Priam, king of Troy, once proud, once noble, now frail and broken, was dragged to the altar of Zeus within his own palace. There, he clung to the statue of the god, begging for mercy, invoking the laws of sanctuary. But Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, showed no reverence. He struck down the old man with a blade, staining the sacred stone with royal blood. In that moment, the last breath of the city seemed to leave its body. Hecuba, the queen, watched her husband die and said nothing. Andromache, Hector's widow, was taken captive, her child torn from her arms. Astyanax, the boy who had once sat on his father's shoulders and laughed at the stars, was hurled from the walls of Troy, lest he grow into a man who might seek revenge. Helen, the face for whom the war had been waged, stood beside Menelaus and waited to be judged. He looked upon her, torn between hatred and longing, and in the end, chose to take her back to Sparta. Whether as wife or prisoner, none could say. In every street, fire rose. The roofs of palaces fell inwards. The towers crumbled. The wind carried the smell of smoke and the cries of the dying across the plain. The horse stood at the center, untouched, its purpose fulfilled. By dawn, the city that had once rivaled the heavens in beauty and strength was nothing but a ruin of blackened stone and broken dreams. Those who lived were taken as spoils. The rest were left in silence. The gods, once so deeply entangled in the fates of men, now stood apart, their temples in ashes, their statues fallen. Perhaps they had known from the beginning that this was the end. Perhaps they had never cared. Troy had fallen. Its songs would live on, but its walls would never rise again. The war was over, the heroes were dead, and all that remained was the long road home. The fires of Troy burned for many days. Smoke curled upward into the dawn sky as if the city was still crying out, even after its voice had been silenced. What had taken centuries to build had been undone in a single night. Stone lay cracked and blackened. Statues melted under heat, and the air was thick with the stench of ash, blood, and broken oil. The sound of weeping came not from the wounded, for most of them were dead, but from those who were taken, women, children, the elderly who had survived the sack only to face slavery. The Greeks wandered through the ruins, not with triumph, but with the dazed stillness of men who had given too much. Their armor was dented, their hands blistered, their faces hollow. Many had come seeking glory, had sung of conquest and fame when they left their homes, but what they found at the end was silence and shadows. There were no parades, there was no peace. The gods had turned their faces away. Among the captives was Andromache, the widow of Hector. Her son had been thrown from the walls by Greek hands, and now she was dragged to the ships as a slave, a prize for Neoptolemus, the same man who had killed her husband's father at the altar. She did not scream. She walked with her head held high, though her eyes no longer blinked. Hecuba, once queen of Troy, sat in chains beside her. Once robed in silk, she was now clothed in dust and bruises. Her sons dead, her city gone, her husband slaughtered before her eyes. It was said that her grief cracked her mind, and in her final years, she no longer spoke to men, only to shadows. Cassandra too was taken. The cursed prophetess, daughter of Priam, had long warned her people of the coming doom. She had cried that Paris would bring ruin, that the horse was a trap, that death would ride with fire through the streets. No one had listened. That was her curse, to see the truth and never be believed. When the Greeks found her at the altar of Athena, she clung to the statue in a final plea for protection. But even the gods no longer listened. She was dragged away by Ajax the Lesser, her cries echoing through the ruined halls. For this crime, Athena turned her wrath against the Greeks, and the gods prepared their punishments. Helen walked among the ashes like a ghost. She had been the spark that lit the flame, the cause for which men died, though none could say what she had truly desired. She had watched her first husband fall, her second betray, and 1,000 others perish for the shape of her face. Menelaus found her at last, her beauty still radiant, though dimmed by sorrow. He looked into her eyes and saw not a seductress or a traitor, but a woman who had been swept into a storm far greater than herself. He took her hand, and together they walked back to the ships. Some say he forgave her, others say he never spoke a word. The Greeks loaded their ships with treasure, with women, with the spoils of a broken city. They prepared to sail, to return to the lands they had not seen in 10 years. But the winds would not carry them home easily. The gods had not forgotten the crimes committed. The rape of Cassandra, the slaughter of Priam at the altar, the betrayal of sacred temples, all had angered the immortals. The sea turned against them. Storms rose. Ships were wrecked. Men who had survived 10 years of war now drowned within sight of their homeland. Ajax the Lesser was struck down by a thunderbolt as his ship was shattered upon the rocks. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, who had ruled in his absence. Menelaus and Helen wandered for years before finding their way back to Sparta. And Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, would take 10 more years to return, wandering through storms and monsters, through the lands of witches and the islands of the dead. Not all the Greeks returned. Some remained in foreign lands, some founded new cities, some vanished into legend. The war had ended, but the cost had not yet been paid. The ghosts of Troy followed them. The songs they had once sung in pride now echoed with regret. Troy had fallen. The towers lay in dust. The gods had turned their eyes elsewhere. But in every hearth across the Aegean, stories were told. Fathers whispered the names of fallen sons. Bards sang of Hector's last stand, of Achilles' fury, of the beauty of Helen and the madness of Cassandra. They sang of the horse and the fire, of the vengeance and the betrayal. They sang of a city that had once stood against the world and held it at bay. Among the few who escaped was Aeneas, cousin to Hector and blood of the royal house. He had fought bravely in the final days, but when the gods showed him the city's fate could not be changed, he turned his face from vengeance and gathered those who could still be saved. With his father upon his back and his son at his side, he led a small band of Trojans through the burning streets and into the wild unknown. They carried little more than a memory of home. For years he wandered across the sea, through storms and strange shores, until at last he reached a new land, far to the west. There, it is said, his descendants would one day build another city, Rome, a city born from the ashes of Troy, founded not by victory, but by survival. Back in Greece, the victors found little joy in their spoils. Agamemnon was slain by his wife before he could remove his armor. Ajax the Greater had already taken his own life in despair. Achilles was dead, and even his son Neoptolemus, though feared and praised, would not live to old age. Odysseus wandered far and long, his return delayed by curses and trials, his kingdom nearly lost by the time he reached its shores. And Helen, whose face had launched 1,000 ships, returned to Sparta and lived on, neither honored nor punished, a ghost in her own hall. The gods, once so entangled in mortal affairs, grew distant. Their temples, once full of sacrifices and praise, echoed with silence. People no longer trusted them so easily. They had seen how quickly gods could raise a man to glory and cast him down in the same breath. The faith that had once lit every city dimmed, replaced by caution, by doubt, and by the quiet worship of survival. But the story of the war lived on. It passed from the lips of old warriors to the ears of young children. Bards sang it beside hearths, their voices low and steady, telling of the wrath of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, the fall of Hector, the grief of Priam. They sang of Helen's beauty, of Cassandra's curse, of the wooden horse that waited with death hidden inside. They told of gods who walked among men, of fates that could not be broken, of a city that stood for 10 years against all the world. And so Troy lived on, not in stone, but in story. In time, the names would blur, the truths would bend beneath the weight of retelling, but the memory would remain, not because of the glory, not because of the gods, but because the war had shown the world something it could not forget. How easily greatness can fall, how quickly fire spreads, and how deep a wound pride can leave behind. And now the tale is told. Rest, for the walls of Troy have fallen, the heroes sleep in quiet earth, and the sea is calm once more. Good night.